given quite a few talks here for the Live Tech Conference, even before it was called that. So here's Father Gearhart.
I guess I have two of these now, no?
There it is.
Should be on, Father.
It is on, yeah. I'm going to talk about subsidiarity, which is a bit of a technical subject, but you're not averse to talking about technical subjects, right? This is a technology conference. And it's an area that I've been interested in for quite some time now. And I've always puzzled why it is that it was not, shall we say, sold very much in the United States, especially by the Bishops' Conference. And I think it might partly be because of its being technical, and not all bishops are technical. But I think it also has something to do with the culture that we live in, which is increasingly diverging from what Jesus established in terms of what he called servant leadership. And I plan to talk about the history of the subject, the logic and implementation of it. That's 3 different topics. And they're kind of major topics in themselves. We can trace the history of the idea of subsidiarity back to biblical and secular roots. We find that there's papal recognition of the idea in some substance, even going beyond what the Bible specifically lays out. Beginning in 1891 with Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum. It's had recognition in the Catholic Catechism since 1992, and since 2004 in the Social Doctrine of the Church. It's also been adopted, theoretically, by the European Union in the Maastricht Treaty going back to 1992. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the actual term in any of the documents, but if you go on Wikipedia, there's basically a claim that, yeah, the European Union's with that too. The logic of subsidiarity, I'm dividing into 2 parts. I'll look at the etymology of the term, which is kind of an interesting, search in and of itself. And then I'll give some definitions and related concepts that are important for implementation. I'll talk about specific servant leadership functions, and specifically when it's appropriate to intervene, for a leader to intervene in what's going on in an organization. And I'll talk about ideals of servant leadership and subsidiarity, and the challenges that we face in our culture to bring it into common practice. When we look at Scripture, we find some early hints at subsidiarity. When we look at 1 Samuel chapter 8, we find the Israelites asking for a human king. They have always had a divine king, but this is the first time they wanted a human king. They wanted a human king because everybody else was doing it. They wanted to do it. And of course that implicitly rejected God as their king. And Samuel had a little discussion with God about that, and God reminded him that it wasn't Samuel they were rejecting, it was he himself.
Right.
God warned of the consequences of a human king, And we have some very sad history in the people of Israel, in the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, and so on. And they paid a heavy price for their choice of a king. Jesus established the principle of servant leadership. In a number of places we find, in particular, explicitly mentioned in Matthew chapter 20 and Mark chapter 10. And we get an example in John chapter 13 with Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. We can also find in Exodus chapter 18 an example of Moses distributing his leadership so that it's not so burdensome to him, and it's better for the people to distribute leadership. We find in the book of Judges a similar example with one of the female judges. That would be, I guess, Judith, is that right?
Or Deborah.
Excuse me, Deborah, thank you. Call it a senior moment.
That's all right.
Yeah, Deborah had a problem with one of her generals kind of chickening out, and he wanted her to be present when he was engaged in battle, and share the responsibility and the risk. And then we find in 1 Peter chapter 5, Peter emphasizing that we should lead by example. When we look at secular contributions, it seems to me that Plato's concept of a philosopher king was inching towards servant leadership. The idea was that a philosopher should serve the people by leading them. And in order to make that work out in practice, he also had a notion that kings should be educated in philosophical ideas and history. We have an example of a real, genuine servant leader in Cincinnatus. In ancient Rome, he was a patrician, statesman, military leader. He was a general who saved the people, and he did that a couple of times. In both cases, he initially led the people, but he retired immediately, or almost immediately, once the battles were won. So he didn't do a Julius Caesar kind of thing. George Washington refused being named king in the United States, the fledgling United States. He retired as a general after victory, and retired as president after 2 terms. Just before earlier today, I just wanted to make sure I knew which constitutional amendment made that necessary. Amendment number 22 limits the number of terms that a president can serve. Alexis de Tocqueville in the 19th century studied how is it that this country, the United States of America, manages to work? How does it manage to flourish? And he discovered in England and in America that there are different causes assigned for the evils of the state and the success. And he always found that the local system was never mentioned specifically when people discuss these issues, but he's talked to individual citizens and discovered that power and prosperity in the country could be attributed to individual people and individual groups of people that form to solve problems, common problems. And that's really what makes a good civilization operate. Papal recognition, as I mentioned, came in Rerum Novarum. If you look at paragraph 14, I won't read this to you. You have You have handouts there. And then 40 years later, Pope Pius XI echoed what Pope Leo said and kind of expanded on it, saying that the state will more freely, powerfully, and effectively do all the things that are necessary to assist people in their lives without imposing rules necessarily, without imposing commands as a king would, but serving the people. He didn't really elaborate it to the extent that it is elaborated today. Pope John the 23rd, in Mater et Magistra, continued to expand on the idea, Paul VI, and especially Pope John Paul II in Centesimus Annus. When we look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we get a kind of a beginning of a definition of what it's about. Paragraph 1883, socialization presents dangers. Excessive intervention by the state can threaten personal freedom and initiative. The teaching of the Church has elaborated the principle of subsidiarity, according to which a community of a higher order should not interfere in the internal life of a community of a lower order. That's kind of the most fundamental aspect of what subsidiarity is about. And then we find similar words in another paragraph. Principle of subsidiarity is opposed to all forms of collectivism. Imagine that, such as socialism, communism. Then we have in the social doctrine of the Church a somewhat more elaborate expression. It's impossible to promote the dignity of the person without showing concern for the family, groups, associations, local territorial realities. In short, for that aggregate of economic, social, cultural, sports-oriented, covering all dimensions of human life, recreational, professional, and so on, to which people spontaneously give life and which makes it possible for them to achieve effective social growth. And now let's look at analyzing the word itself. It turned out to be a little bit of a challenge to kind of get to the real essence of the source of the word itself. When we look in the Oxford English Dictionary, we find subsidy and subsidiary that are related terms. Subsidy comes from the Latin subsidium, meaning assistance. Subsidiary from Latin subsidiarius, serving to help. And then the ity at the end takes a noun and, it forms a noun denoting quality or condition. So the quality or condition of serving to help is one possible definition of subsidiarity. To dig a little deeper, we need to look at a little more Latin. We can compare this to the term presidium, which points to a protection, a garrison, a presidium, as in the Roman presidium. Then the verb preside, from Latin praesidere, pre meaning before, and sedere meaning sit. So someone who sits before an assembly presides at the assembly. And so I would say, to change pre to sub, you get the meaning. So subsidiary, meaning sub, under, and sedere, sit, to sit under. So instead of sitting before, you sit under. You might think of milking a cow as well as washing feet. That kind of gives you an idea about what subsidiarity is all about, servant leadership. I have a proposed technical definition that uses kind of specific terms. Subsidiarity is the principle by which organic communities, I'm going to define what that means later, operate in their sphere sovereignty. I'll try and define that later. That's actually a Protestant term the Calvinists invented. Assisted and regulated by higher level servant leadership, of course that's Jesus, as may be essential to the common good. And the common good is a term you find all over the social doctrine of the church. Then in the Catechism, to summarize, a community of a higher order should not interfere in the internal life of a community of a lower order, depriving the latter of its functions, rather should support it in case of need, and help to coordinate its activity with the activities of the rest of society, always with a view to the common good. And then in Wikipedia we find a relatively simple sentence that begins to talk about what it is. A principle of social organization that holds that social and political issues should be dealt with at the most immediate or local level that is consistent with their resolution. Now the interesting thing about that is it doesn't identify a role for leadership per se. Now let's look at the concepts that I've used in my definition. Organic communities, the principle of sphere sovereignty, servant leadership, common good. And then it seems to me there's a key notion that needs to be supplied to determine when it's appropriate to intervene at a lower level. And I had the insight a couple of years ago, maybe a few years ago, that there was a connection here between intervening at a lower level and just war theory, the just war theory of the church. What's an organic community? A community is organic if it forms through natural social interaction, supports a common interest and operates autonomously under traditional or contracted principles and rules. Examples that are really essential are family, a clan or tribe, a village, city, state, nation, church, political party, professional society, economic social interest group, unions, companies, NGOs. There's really nothing that tells you that a certain kind of community is not organic as long as it satisfies these essential ingredients that it forms organically. Sphere sovereignty. Wikipedia describes sphere sovereignty as being originating in Calvinism, also known as differentiated responsibility, concept that each sphere or sector of life has its own distinct responsibilities and authority or competence, stands equal to all other spheres of life. And it seems to me I needed to add a little more detail. I said sphere sovereignty denotes the right to self-government of an organic community within its own natural sphere of interest. Where such communities have overlapping peer-to-peer responsibilities, they enjoy the right to negotiate the details of responsibility sharing. Communities with related interests naturally come together in larger spheres without necessarily losing their individual sovereignty, but yield to guidance, arbitration, or adjudication as necessary to preserve peace when conflicts arise between them. And as yet, we're not talking about interference from a higher leader type of thing. Servant leadership functions oversight of a natural community or sovereign sphere, oversee commerce between and among communities, sovereign spheres. For example, in the Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution, you find such a rule or set of rules for governing commerce between states. Oversight functions of the non-invasive nature, monitoring, guidance, arbitration, adjudication. And then we get into coercive policing, which is invasive. And it's not an exhaustive list. You can look at the Book of Judges for further examples. Interference may be necessary and justified to preserve natural rights of participating individuals or communities. So fundamentally, interference is justified when fundamental rights are being violated. And that's where I got the idea for just war theory. Servant leaders preside at conventions to negotiate norms of interaction between and among communities, and servant leaders operate according to natural and/or formal authority. Let's see, I think I backed up here. Here we go. That takes us to just war theory, and we can find it defined in the Catechism, paragraph 2309. The strict conditions for legitimate defense by military force require rigorous consideration. The gravity of such a decision makes it subject to rigorous conditions of moral legitimacy. At one and the same time, in other words, all these conditions should be fulfilled before even thinking of military intervention. The damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. All other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. There must be a serious prospect of success. The use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. The power of modern means of destruction weighs very heavily in evaluating this condition. And then the last condition, the evaluation of these conditions for moral legitimacy belongs to the prudential judgment of those who have responsibility for the common good. In a democracy, that's everybody.
Right. Supposed to be.
And so implementation for just invasive intervention in subsidiarity, we can echo just war theory and say it's justified in order to when there is grave and or lasting damage of a physical, psychological, or moral nature. And if less invasive interventions prove ineffective, if there is a serious expectation of success, and the intervention must not produce equivalent or greater damage. And in place of basically focusing on who has the authority to decide, as far as possible, norms should be established to cover anticipated cases. It seems to me that when we look at something like when families fail to thrive because there's abuse going on, there are all kinds of norms already established for intervention, and we can work on norms that would apply to other spheres, other sovereign spheres besides the family. Okay, then we look at ideals, and this gets, again, also we get into some technical terms here. Ideals of minimized intervention. Natural, social, political, and economic units can flourish or fail independently and according to a just order. In other words, leadership is not responsible for making sure that individual sphere sovereignties flourish. That's their job, right? The job of a family is to flourish. The job of a community is to flourish according to the common good of that unit and the society at large. So it's not a part of servant leadership to interfere when a family makes bad decisions, as long as there's no violation of human rights. They should be allowed to succeed or fail on their own. Experience is the strongest teacher, right? So if you interfere all the time with what's going on, you're not allowing experience to teach. What I call common mode failures can be avoided. That's actually a technical term from systems theory. Common mode failures can be avoided. I'll get into what that means. Moral hazard can be avoided. That's another technical term, moral hazard. That's from economics. Guidance is normally helpful but not intrusive in subsidiarity. Unit abuses can be corrected with minimal damage or intrusion. Beginning with advice and escalating from there as necessary when serious damage continues to occur. Larger multi-unit common interests can be protected. Okay, a couple of technical terms. Common mode failure. When subsidiary units directed by a common executive logic, think computers, all fail due to errors, unforeseen or otherwise, in that common logic. Examples of common mode failure can be found in the crashes of 1929 and 2008 and 9, the debt crises, the personality that seems to be more and more common today that referred to snowflakes, and civil war. All of these things can be examples of common mode failure, where everybody gets the same bad ideas. And how do they get them? Typically top down, but sometimes bottom up. Moral hazard. When a group or individual is overprotected, for example in insurance, and that leads to diminished self-governance and straying into increasingly risky behavior or excessive, for example, expensive dependency. People develop rash expectations. And when that happens, you get some things like the breakdown of the family, welfare dependency, building in flood-prone areas, earthquake-prone areas, and finally corruption. Corruption is an example of something that arises in a situation of moral hazard. Okay, ongoing challenges. Generational memory and civic virtue decay naturally from one generation to the next, in good times and bad. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's from Lord John Acton. Yeah. And I notice we don't have quite the most recent file here.
So it's
Okay, underneath,
Is the one you
yeah, well, I've got it here. And you also all have it on the handout. Monopoly power tends to corrupt government. I don't know if you've noticed that.
No kidding.
Power relationships change with communications and information technology. Facebook wouldn't exist without that, right? Google wouldn't exist without that.
Right.
And they came to a pretty significant power over our lives with their rapid growth. And lastly, a continuing challenge to subsidiarity, that body politic needs wisdom and concord on the nature and content of the common good. That's something that we don't get a lot of commonality in terms of what we see as the common good.
Right.
And until we do, we have a real problem with civilization, and implementing subsidiarity would probably be very difficult. I think we have
can
time.
stay on schedule with 10 minutes of questions.
So is it fair to say that the idea of subsidiarity is kind of opposed to the idea of supersidiarity, which arises either in the business realm, but also among socialists and collectivists in the government?
Thank you. In the governmental realm, under the rubric of economy of scale.
Yeah, well, when we look at how a country like China or Venezuela or North Korea is run, it's basically top down. That's an example of the opposite of subsidiarity, which we can call supersidiarity. Right, so you can think of the leader sitting up high above everybody
And lording it over
and
them.
lording it over them,
Exactly.
right?
You mean China, like China Inc.?
China Inc., yeah, okay, yeah.
That
Yeah.
is kind of a bit of a misnomer, because there are just loads of entrepreneurial organizations in China. That's a big part of their.
Right, but
success.
they all
So
take,
they
they all take
they
their,
all take their marching orders from the guy up
yeah,
top.
yeah.
So the generational memory loss,
Yeah, well, haven't
Is
you
that-
seen that?
huh? Well, we're living it.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
But when did we start to lose our memory? I mean, how far back does this memory loss? Does it go back to the Constitution, World War II? We don't realize who we are and how we got here.
Yeah.
How, is it additive?
Well, you can probably trace a lot of the change to at least the time of the progressive movement.
When, okay.
Well, that goes back to the late 19th century.
Yeah. Of the 1890s.
And of course, you know, there was a thread of destruction built in when people started paying attention to the ideals developed before the French Revolution, like especially Jean-Jacques Rousseau, saying that human beings were innately good in the primitive state, right?
See, that all goes back to, I think, a lot of the problems we have today are caused by,
Mistake right there.
like I keep saying all the time, just the prosperity that we have. We don't have to work hard for anything anymore.
Right.
So we spend too much time in leisure, maybe.
Yeah. You've heard the term government entitlements.
Oh, yeah.
Right. All too many.
And you realize that Social Security is not considered a government entitlement? That's the one thing that is an entitlement, because people paid into it, right? So in an economic sense, it's an entitlement,
Yeah, it's our money.
right? It's our, well, yeah. But interestingly enough, government decided that it was its money.
And they took it too.
They did, right?
So what do we have to do to get our memory back? The joke in today's world is civil war.
Yeah, people, yeah. Yeah, people.
I mean, given how fractured we are today, that's, to me, that's like, that could be.
It's a serious possibility, it is.
Yeah, I actually was thinking of asking a question, so I'm going to follow up with my question on what he just said. That it seems that the natural solution to harmonizing communities where you have a lot of variety of opinion would be subsidiarity. That let the smaller groups handle what they can because they have common values.
Right,
And then
right.
they'll be able to address those situations. Now, they
Right.
can't address everything, but in
Right.
their sphere of sovereignty, they could. So it seems like that would be a natural kind of solution to propose to that particular problem.
And we do have the historical,
We do have a historical example that even in, for example, a big issue in our time, medical care. There's a book by, is it David Beito, B-E-I-T-O, entitled, what is it, From Fraternal Care to the Welfare State, Medical Care in the 19th to early 20th century. But he discusses the role of fraternal organizations as the main means of providing medical care for the citizenry of the nation up until the middle of the 20th century, with the rise of the professional medical organizations and the rise of who basically lobbied the state to be able to coordinate everything under the rubric of, again, economy of scale. And their disparagement of what they call lodge medicine as being substandard. It also reminds me of the old, that the idea of loss of memories goes longer than even a republic. I think the Roman poet Horace had the line, "Injurious time, who can escape thy curse? Evil our grandsires were, our parents worse, and we, till now unmatched in ill, must bring forth children more corrupted still."
Wow. We have a couple minutes left. One more question? Okay, let's take a 10-minute break and we'll come back after that.